really wonderful to be able to have a panel discussion. We're trying a little bit of a new format. In years past, we've often had 3, 4, or 5 Rebbes on a panel, and we've gotten some feedback that would be a little more exciting, perhaps, to have maybe a little more of like I don't want to say debate, but like a one-on-one for the following reasons. A, it gives each panelist more of an opportunity to express their opinion, and B, it allows, hopefully allow for more time for you guys to be able to ask questions at the end. Okay, so that'll be the goal. The topic for today's panel is divine providence, and I'll just throw out the first question. Is the natural order real or an illusion? If I stub my toe, was God involved? And maybe what leads to your position, traditional sources, logic, empirical experience, etc.
Wait, you want to combine both those questions?
We can separate them if you want. That's okay.
Okay, give me a available answer if I combine them.
So let's do natural or real and illusion.
Fine. So I say before we start that I wasn't feeling so well this morning, and Rav Dovid'l took care of me, so he definitely is not looking for any upper hand in this discussion. Okay. So my position is that the natural order is real. Okay, what does that mean? That when I do things, the causative impact that it has is direct. Meaning if I put on my sweatshirt so I am not as cold as I was, right? I caused that to happen. Now I just want to point out that there's another position which says there, in some Achronim that says that there is no causative impact. Just to be fair to the other position, you might hear it from Rav Dovid'l, that they still think you have to do something, right? The classic term is hishtadlut. But they'll often say explicitly, even though you have to do something, it's not true that what you do actually causes the result. It's just some kind of tax you have to pay or some kind of punishment, as the case may be. So you might think at that point there's no difference, because both positions will say you have to act, whether you're having a direct causal impact or not. But I think we'll see as we go along here, there are real differences. For example, if I take the second theory, I might minimize my hishtadlut. And I might say, okay, I have to do something to be yotzi, as it were. But trying harder, let's say, to earn more money wouldn't really make sense. Whereas, if you really think that there's a causal relationship between your initiative and your activity and the results, so then trying harder would make sense. That's the first thing I wanted to say. So I think that at that point in my mind, Hashem is not running every moment of my life. So I admit it, when I stub my toe, I do not say, I must have spoken Lashon Hara this morning. I say, I stub my toe because I'm not so careful. I walk too quickly from place to place. That is why I stub my toe. Okay, if you ask me in my position, when does Hashem step in? I freely admit I cannot give you a definitive answer. Okay, I do not know how frequently Hashem steps in or when he does. But I certainly don't assume that it is all the time. I think there's certain events where you feel more confident about it. Like, let's say a people are struggling with the worst event in their history, and then they get a Jewish state, right, 3 years later, right? So maybe there I'll feel confident that Hashem had something to do with that. Okay, but for the most part, I would say I'm really not sure. If you ask me why would Hashem set up a world this way, where he is not controlling everything, I would say this is a world which enhances human freedom and human responsibility. That if we had a real sense that our activities don't impact on the world, right? So at that point, I think, in a certain sense, we're like outsourcing responsibility. And I think Hashem wanted us to feel the utmost responsibility.
Can we do 2 minutes on the source?
Oh, I thought we were going to do sources separately.
You can go below.
You can do whatever you want.
Well, I will just sense it at the time, so I guess I'll try to keep it to a similar amount of time. Shalom, everybody. Good morning. This is our first discussion. It's still a panel of sorts, and certainly not a debate between two colleagues who are very fond of each other. Just trying to iron out certain ways of looking at the world, and perhaps different lenses with which we look at the same thing. But obviously, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the way we look at things. I always like to start the first panel of the year with a caveat that I am a young man of 41 years old, and I don't have everything worked out. Just because I teach Torah for a living doesn't mean that I have the answers, and that's obvious. But there's something absurd about standing up here and presenting my position as if it's a fully developed position, seeing as it's something that obviously, from the time that I entered this yeshiva until now, has shifted or changed. I've learned nuances in the way of trying to articulate something which is very profound. So that's obviously, that's before I even get started, work in progress, as your understanding distinction as well. and we're just here to ask some questions and try to understand. So Rav Blau represented a position which was more thinking of limitations and why it might be helpful for looking at the world through limiting the scope of God's interaction with the world, or interference with the world, or divine providence over the world. And I'm going to present the other side of that, which is to try to maximize Hashem's involvement in the world. But to answer the specific question, I think the question was, is the world an illusion or not? And at the risk of sort of dancing past each other, I would start off, and I think it will come to a head, which is why I'm excited that we're doing this in this way, of two people instead of multiple, because sometimes we just don't get to the issues, is to answer that question forthrightly, yes, the world is definitely an illusion. The world is 100% an illusion, and let me explain what I mean by that. I mean that on a few different levels. On the most basic level, we all know that the world is an illusion because we understand, every single person sitting here knows that even though there are radio waves and there's ultraviolet light that is in the world right now, none of you have the proper gear, you're not wearing the right things to be able to hear the radio, unless you have a radio chip in your brain to be able to, you have an antenna in your brain. We're getting there soon, I think we'll get there. But just because there are slices of reality that we do not see, then yes, on some level there is a trick, there's an illusion that's being played on us in the sense that we don't have the entire scope of what is possible to know at our fingertips. And even if we could develop tools to be sensitive to those things, it's clear that the way that we see the world is somewhat skewed. Anyone from the time that you don't have to have experimented or grown up in the 60s or 70s to know this. Anytime anyone's ever been on a merry-go-round from the time that you were 5 years old and you got off the merry-go-round for the first time, and the whole world continues spinning when you're not spinning anymore, and you realize wait a minute, how is it still spinning? Oh, because there's a perception that's happening inside of me, and my perception of reality is only a thin slice of the reality that actually exists. But first, did anyone have that experience? Am I the only one? Am I the only one who went on a merry-go-round when I was a kid? Right? When you go on, and all of a sudden you realize the perception of reality is not reality, then yes, the world is 100%. It has illusory nature to it. Now, the question then becomes, in the specific question to, is the world an illusion and do I stub my toe? I'm not sure that those two necessarily overlap with each other 100%. I'm curious to when we get to the point where we're talking about sources for this idea, because it's not a secret here. I'm not as well versed in Moreh Nevuchim as Blau is, but in my preparation for this discussion and in previous years, I've read through certain parts of Moreh Nevuchim, and the Rambam in the 17th chapter of the third Chelek of Moreh Nevuchim uses an example, not of stubbing toes, but uses an example of a thorn going into a person's hand, even for a moment, and then it gets taken out. The pain that that he was not being careful, as Rabbi pointed out, and he rubbed his hand against the stender in the wrong way, and he got a thorn in his hand. And the Rambam seems to say that's a divine punishment. And even if I come to the same conclusion as Rabbi, that I don't fully understand the calculus of how that happened, and as a person who will readily admit that I've spent together with my wife a sum total of something like 12 years in Camp Hask, and it's hard to establish that some of the Camp Hask campers are being punished, or the parents are being punished. That's not a simple thing to say, and that's a problem that the Rambam has to deal with, and everyone has to deal with. But I'm not sure that the escape route that I would take personally is the escape route of saying God is not in charge of the world, and God is not. But I would claim the same level of mystery to the world and not being able to understand, while simultaneously saying that there is a human element of commandedness, which gives us an element of free choice, and there is also a claim or some sort of assumption that God is also tzedek and mishpat is part of that attributes of God, and so everything that God does is merciful and there's a mishpat to it. But not squaring those two circles, the circle and the square, is going to be very difficult. But that's the opening position. The opening position is that Hashem, yes, is in charge of everything. Hashem is in charge of both things that happen to us, with the exclusion of our own free will and our commandedness, and also, which is going to be, for sure, the Rambam does not agree with this second latter point, that even the drops of rain falling and the leaves, Hashem is in charge of that, because fundamentally the way that I view the world, which is different than the way that Rav views the world, is through the lens that there's an imminence to the divine creating the world at every second that's happening over and over again, which means that Hashem is part and parcel of the world to the degree that he cannot escape being part of the world. The fact that He is recreating the world at every moment, He is baked into the world in some sense. Nothing happens without Hashem's guidance. So we'll parse that out, and I'll have to sidestep or backtrack on certain ways that I articulated things, because even as I'm saying it, they're not coming out 100% clear, but that's basically going to be my position, and we're going to try to talk that over the next little bit.
Okay, so stay up here. So I'll have you, we'll talk about the sources for that. So you mentioned the source in the Rambam, but what are the sort of primary sources that lead to your belief? And you can also include, like, if you have this sort of logical thing, maybe your empirical experience, the way you sort of happen to experience the world, does that also impact the way you think about it?
So, let's start with this. I'll start with something we find from Tefillah. Right? The notion from Tefillah of Hamachadesh B'tuvo Kol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Bereishis. Hamachadesh B'tuvo, God is in His goodness. Chadesh, He is making new. Right? B'chol Yom Tamid. Not only every day, but every day constantly. Right? That Tamid becomes the Chol Yom Tamid. So this becomes the linchpin, I would say, of all the things that we could point to, and there are many Ma'amar Chazal that go this way or that way. I would say for me, the linchpin for this idea is the idea that Hashem is Mechadesh B'tuvo B'chol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Bereishis. God is constantly recreating the world every single moment. Is a major source. I would say that's one major source for the development of this idea that if Hashem is recreating, and let me take a step back in the other direction. One of the primary sources in the other direction, one of the reasons the Rambam, let me present like this, although I feel that maybe I'm stepping on glass territory. There's a Rambam that...
Step away.
There's a Rambam in the Parish of Mishnayos, to Pirkei Avos, where the Rambam discusses 10 things that were somewhat miraculous. We're familiar with a lot of them, the Korach's pit, they opened up the different miracles that happened throughout Tanakh, that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says must have been from the 7 days of creation. Like, these things were baked into the cake from the beginning. The Rambam used this as an example, or as a pedestal to stand on and say, the reason why these things had to be from the beginning is because any change to the natural order that would happen midway, like what happened today, would be God changing His mind mid-story. And since God doesn't change His mind, and God doesn't change in any way, so therefore those things must be part of the original creation. And if you'll ask, but the original creation itself is a change because we believe that the world is not a static state universe like Aristotle and Rambam did, right? So then it must be that there was not a world and now there is a world. Isn't that a change? So he says that's like Kodem Habriya, we don't understand things like that. Okay, good? From the perspective of Hamachadesh B'tuvo Chol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Bereishis, the world is being recreated every single second by God, and that the world is being animated by God every second, and God would not need to destroy the world in order to undo the world, but rather that the world continues to exist every moment because God wills it to exist, which is a basic presupposition of the Kabbalistic and Hasidic tradition. So that if God is constantly recreating the world, then we don't really have the Rambam's question. Because in the same way that the Rambam said that there's this special injunction that he's invoking, that the first time God created the world, something mysterious happened, and it looked like there was a change, but it's not really a change. I would say the same thing is happening every moment. And so God can direct the molecules, or the raindrops, or the leaves, however He wills them to fall. And that there would be some level of, like the Rambam himself says, of midah keneged midah, and some level of reward and punishment, in a way that I still have to beg to Rav Blau's same idea that I have no idea how that works. And the Rambam says we have no idea how that mishpat works. But our job is merely to take the incoming data and then work with that to better ourselves in some way. So I'll start with that and see where it goes.
Okay. Guys, even though I think I'm more known for short answers, it's going to be a little longer than usual. All right. So I think if you ask me why I came to my position, I would say it's a combination of traditional sources and empirical experience. So I'll start with the traditional sources. I'll say right away, there's no question that there's sources on both sides. Like, I think you can say that all the sources are on one side of the tradition. I will note an interesting phenomena that I think is the difference between the Rishonim and the Achronim. Okay, the position that denies the natural order is very prominent in the last 300 years. Just to get some names, you can get it in Mesilat Yesharim, you can get it in Michtav Meliel, Reb Dessler, you can get it in Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, Sichas Musar. That is quite common. I'm going to try to show in a few minutes that if you look at most of the Rishonim from the medieval period, that is not the way they thought about the world. We'll get to that in a minute. But I want to start already with Chazal. And I think often, it's very tricky, but you should never have someone prove a philosophy from one Mamar Chazal. Chazal were very varied, and very interesting. And we give you one of the Gemaras I often find a bit humorous that really has both positions. Okay, so this Shabbos Lamed Bet. 3 Amoreim are trying to figure out, should they take the ferry to go across? Is it dangerous or not? So here we go. So Rav will offer b'maver diyatav be'akum. Rav would not go if there was a non-Jew in the ferry. I guess he thought the non-Jews of his time were not so righteous, so maybe God's going to punish the ferry, it'll collapse, and he'll be in it, he'll be stuck. So Rav wouldn't go. Shmuel wouldn't go unless there was an akum there. Okay, what was Shmuel's thinking? What are the odds that 2 different ethnicities are high punishment at the same time? Okay, but notice the combination, both Rav and Shmuel are thinking in terms of divine providence. Right, should I get into this boat? Is God liable to punish or not? Then, the third Amor shows up. Rav Yanai Badik Va'avar. He checked and he would go. According to Rashi, what did he check? Badik Hasfina Shelo Yeba Nekev. What was his method? He didn't figure out if there's a non-Jew there or not. He said, well, let's check the boat. Does it look sturdy or not? If it doesn't look like it has a hole, I'll get it. If it looks like it's not so sturdy, I won't. So I think right there you have, like some are thinking in terms of God running the world, and one of them are thinking in terms of, no, let's just function within natural order. That's how the world works. Okay, now let's get to the Rishonim. And here, I apologize guys, I'm going to do 4, but I'll try to do them very quickly. Okay, so the Ran, who you know from Halacha, has a sefer of drashot. In the 10th drasha, he deals with a classic phrase that in theory might lead to the other position. Right, his psukim in Sefer Dvarim, Parachet, where God warns us against saying, Kochi v'otzim yadi asur yetachayil hazeh. Right, don't say that it was my strength that did it. Okay, so that sounds like, oh, it's really not human initiative. Okay, so here, give me one second, guys. There's 2 versions of the 10th drasha. I can see which one to use. There it is. Okay. So he says, what is the meaning of don't say kochi dotzimeti? People do have talents and abilities. People are born more intelligent and the like. I mean, the rich person in theory could say it because it really was his intelligence and diligence that got it done. I mean, why do you have intelligence? Because God created you with intelligence. But notice, according to his reading, the pasuk's not saying you didn't do it. Saying you did it, but don't forget that you have abilities because of a God that created you. Okay, so that's the Ran. Now the second one is even more surprising because the Ramban has a famous passage that seems to go in the other direction. Right, the Ramban has a passage at the end of Blau where he says that everything is a miracle. Everything is divine providence. However, people don't realize that there are other Rambans. Okay, David Berger has an excellent article on this, which I am not going to quote right now. I'll just refer to it. But in Bereshit Perek Yudchet Pasuk Yudchet, the Ramban talks as follows. This is on a pasuk Yidat B'Manash Yisrael Ben Vad Be'Davach Rav, etc., etc. Says the Ramban, Ki Yediat Hashem She'Hashgachato B'Olam HaShafel. What is the knowledge of God? He Lishmor HaKlalim, to guard the general, like general providence. V'Gam B'nei Adam Munuchim Bo Limikrim. And people are left to happenstance. But for those that are pious, then God goes further and knows them individually and guards them individually. So the same Raman who had the Shmot has this famous quote that everything's a miracle, seems to strike a very different note when he's talking about Avram. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into it, but those who are really curious, also look at the Ramban's commentary on Eov, Perek Lamed Vav, Pasuk Zayin, where he advances the same position. Okay, so that's the Ramban. Now, I won't do 4, that'll be too much. I'll just do the Morning Mukham also.
I'm probably going to comment on the Ramban, so, meaning, if you want to talk to each other.
You know what, you comment on, then I'll see if I want to comment back. Okay? Oh, you mean you want to do that?
No, I have to do it right now.
Okay.
I'm saying
so, Rav Dovid'l correctly quoted Gimel Yud Zayin in the Morning Mukham. I would just suggest that has to be balanced with the following 2 chapters. In the next chapter, in 3:18, The Rambam says as follows. I couldn't find the Hebrew, so I'm going to have to read from English, even though they're both translations anyway. Here we go. 3:18, where the Rambam says, it follows in accordance with what I mentioned. The greater the share in which a person has obtained of this divine influence, on account of both his physical predisposition and his training, the greater must also be the effect of divine providence upon him. For the action of divine providence is proportional to the endowment of intellect, as has been mentioned above. And then he says, what about people who are not such good people? So he says, in the same proportion as ignorant and disobedient persons are deficient in that divine influence, their condition is inferior, and their rank equal to that of irrational beings, and they are like unto the beasts. Now that's a little strong, but what the Rambam basically saying, that if you're not a good person, your interaction with God is like an animal, and for the Rambam, animals only have hashkacha klalit and not hashkacha pratit, meaning they only have general providence, not individual providence. God makes sure that beavers survive. He's not interested in this particular beaver. Okay, so that, I'm not going to do any more, but I think that shows a certain current of thought in the Rishonim, in the Ran, the Ramban, Rambam, which doesn't think that the natural is an illusion, and does not think that our efforts don't really have causal impact. Okay, that's in terms of sources. Although again, as I said, Achronim tend to go in a different direction. In terms of empirical, I guess I would say that's just the way I experience the world. I experience the world that people who try harder and have better ideas, they succeed. Where people who don't try so hard and have worse ideas, they don't succeed. Just give you a few silly examples if you don't mind, since you guys like sports. Like, let's say we decide, we're going to have a clock, and now the pitcher and batter have to get ready by a certain amount of time. Guess what? Lo and behold, games get shorter, right? And not because God had to step in to make games shorter. Like, no, it just follows from having a pitch clock, right? That's what does it, right? Or here we go. We think people are hitting too many extra points, so we move the kick back, and all of a sudden people start missing more. Again, these are things that you could just explain in the causality of nature with such ease. Now, I admit sometimes you have the law of unintended consequences. It is true, so we do A, and yet we think it's going to produce B, and it produces C. I admit that. But I think even in those cases, we often can look back and understand where we got it wrong. Like, let's say we change the electoral threshold in Israel, like how many votes you have to get for your party to be in the Knesset. And we thought it would produce A and it produced B. Okay, that might be true, but I think when looking back, we can explain it. So just the way I experience the world is a world where the causal relationships make sense, and therefore it seems to me we should function within those relationships.
So that. Okay, so I'll address a few things. The Maimer Chazal about checking for the hole in the boat, and in general, I think this is one of the slippery issues of this discussion. Is there's a few different elements that are all in the mix, and we're trying to put them all together. So the real question is not whether one rabbi took more precaution than another rabbi. The question is whether, in the event that he would have checked for the hole in the boat, and then there would have been a collision with an iceberg and the boat sank, would that have been the will of God, divine providence, as it were, or would it not? So I think the Rambam, I'm not 100% sure where Blau falls out. I don't think he's strictly Maimonidean in his approach, but I think the Rambam would say that if you check for the hole in the boat, and then the boat sank, the Rambam has this funny dance that he does where he says, well, the fact that the boat sank, because the boat is an inanimate object, well, that's just a happenstance. But the fact that you were on the boat is a divine punishment. That's what the Rambam says explicitly. And that's an interesting dance that he's doing, but I'm not sure that we would escape the issue of divine providence here. If somebody checks for a hole in the boat, and the boat still sinks, we still would have to answer the question, is that divinely providential, or is that something that just accidentally happened? And our reaction to that might totally change, depending on how we look at those two things. Okay, so I want to go to a number of things. Let's go to I'm going to do the Rambam first, actually, since you mentioned last. The Rambam in the 18th chapter of Moreh Nevuchim, which, again, like I said, I'm not well versed in Moreh Nevuchim, but just hearing the Blau reading it, so this is one of the issues. I don't usually get into this, but this is one of the issues of, I guess, both experientially or emotionally, why it doesn't resonate with me, the whole idea that the Rambam is presenting here. And that is that if you assume that somehow there is more divine providence if you are more intellectually adept, then it leaves a really strong question in the other direction of like, well, some people are not as intellectually adept as others by no fault of their own, no matter how hard they try. And so that's going to leave like a little bit of a mishpat issue, just as well as any other, theodicy issue that you might have. I couldn't help but notice, but when Rav Blau was reading it, he tried to make it sound like the Rambam was saying that if you're a good person, you have more divine providence. But the Rambam doesn't say if you're a good person; he says if you're smarter. Not more smarter. If you're not beastly and you have divine intellect, and it's more about being smart. It's not about being a simple servant of God or something like that. And that's a big question that kind of just emotionally resonates with me in terms of the Rambam's approach. The Rambam leaves this as kind of like an elitist class of like you have to climb the ranks. Not that we shouldn't try to be, we should try to become Bali Seichel as well. I think that's a valuable thing. But to hinge divine providence on how on my IQ seems a little bit strange emotionally to me. The Rambam in the 17th paragraph, I only realized afterwards that it was very silly of us that we should have not that I thought, but we should think for future. We should have them read the 17th chapter in English before. That should be part of morning Seder before we do it.
Excellent idea.
Right? So silly that we don't, because the Rambam there presents, and to waste the time on it now, but I'll do it very, very quickly. The Rambam lists there 5 different approaches to divine providence, which he rejects the first 4, and the 5th one is and the first one is basically what he calls the view of the Apikorsim, of the Epicureans, which is to say that the world is complete random and chaos and there's absolutely no guiding force at all. The second, which he also rejects, even though you might be surprised if you think that the Rambam is just a straight Aristotelian, he says this is the approach of Aristotle, and he says the approach of Aristotle, which sounds bizarre to our modern ears, is that God only controls everything in the heavens down to the moon. Right? There's like all these planetary, like this is totally not our way of looking at the world, and then he thinks only to the moon, that's like God is in control of that, because those are they follow a routine, and this speaks to this whole idea of God not changing. So there's like an orbit that's happening, and there's no change there, so God could be in control of that. But where all the change happens down here, that's not the realm of divine involvement, and he rejects that as well. Then he quotes 2 Muslim approaches, which are basically God is in control of everything, and it's either God is in control of everything and we don't understand it, or God is in control of everything, and we do understand it, it's just that the answer is in Olam Haba we'll get paid back for any pain or injustice that seems to, like that's the issues that he's dealing with. It would have been really worthwhile to read all that, and then he gives his own approach as well. But I'm just sharing that, not because it supports my position, it's just like, it anchors the whole discussion in recognizing that the question about divine providence, how much Hashem controls the world, is being had within the context of the question of how can bad things happen. We have to answer that question, right? Which, at the end of the day, both the Rambam and the Islamic approach and Rav Blau and I all come to this conclusion, which is we don't really have an answer. So what I'm saying is that my approach doesn't in any way get hindered by the fact that I don't have an answer to this theodicy issue. And then I come back to the other source. Let's go to the Ramban now for a moment. And it is true that the Ramban has many, many different sections. In preparation for this as well, a little tiny bit when I was thinking last night, I was like, I really would like to write an essay on the Ramban's approach to, and maybe I will. That would be a nice thing that would come out of this. Because I think the Ramban's approach to divine providence and nisim and these things are very complicated. I'm not sure that I have the answer, but I'd like to present just like a seedling of the beginning of the approach that I'm starting to develop in terms of thinking these things, because I've been thinking about the Ramban for a long time. And the Ramban is sort of seen in many ways as the at loggerheads with the Rambam in many different things in rationalism and mysticism. Maybe the Rabbi is a better candidate. We'll talk about that in a different panel later in the year. But the Ramban. So the Ramban, as Rav Blau alluded to, has a very famous comment in Parshas Bo, where he's talking about the reason why so many of the mitzvahs are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why do we put on tefillin Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim? And our mezuzahs are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we sit in Sukkah Zecher to the Sukkahs that Hashem took out of Mitzrayim. And Pesach, everything is Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. And the Ramban says, in a somewhat lengthy essay, that Hashem doesn't step in and do miraculous things so often. Now, I understand that undermines my point. He doesn't step in and do miraculous things so often. And so, when Hashem did this big sound and light show, Yetzias Mitzrayim, we need to instantiate that in so many mitzvos so that we can remember that God is always stepping in and doing things all the time. Well, hold on a second. So, Minei Ubei, the Ramban, he doesn't step in or he does step in? Right? He doesn't step in, what I would say, the Ramban is clearly saying, he doesn't step in such an explicit way, where there's something that's so remarkable that's happening. So there's a very, and Rav Blau quoted a different Ramban, where the Ramban talks about, happenstance and mikra, and depending on your status, Hasidov, maybe have a special level of divine providence. There's another Ramban that I want to speak to, and again, we have to put all these Rambans together, because the Ramban was one person, and he wasn't a fool. I'm saying it was the Ramban. The Ramban is an amazing essay, which I think is so important for understanding this discussion about divine providence and miracles, where the Ramban asks the following question. He's dealing with the Ibn Ezra's, the Ibn Ezra's upset. The Ibn Ezra is upset that the Torah would suggest that, or Rashi would suggest actually, the Ibn Ezra said that Chazal would suggest that Yocheved is born between the walls on the way down to Mitzrayim. You guys familiar with this medrash? That Yocheved, the mother of Moshe Rabbeinu, is born as they're going through tax authority down to Mitzrayim like the first time, right? And that's how you resolve the issue of counting how many people went down to Mitzrayim, because it says that there's 70 people who went down with Yaakov to Mitzrayim, but if you count it, there's actually 71. And one approach is that Yocheved is kind of born, at customs. Okay? And Rashi takes this approach and runs with it and assumes this to be pshat in the pasuk. And Ibn Ezra is furious with this idea that Chazal would say such a thing, because if you just do a little bit of math, it will turn out that Moshe Rabbeinu was 80 years old when he took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. You subtract 80 years from 210, and it turns out that Yocheved gave birth to Moshe Rabbeinu when she's in her mid-100s, which is quite a bit after when Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak just a few parshas ago. And the Torah makes a whole big fuss about how Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak when she was 90 years old. But here we have a woman in her mid-100s who's giving birth, and the Torah doesn't say boo about it. So clearly Yocheved did not give birth to Moshe Rabbeinu in her mid-100s. She was born between the walls. That's all a trash. That's the Ibn Ezra's approach. And then the Ramban says, this is the important Ramban, I'm sorry to go at length, but it's important. The Ramban says the Ibn Ezra is missing a fundamental idea about what it means when miracles are described in the Torah. The Ramban says miracles are described in the Torah in order to show that Hashem keeps His promises. So he says, the only reason the Torah even tells us that Sarah gave birth at this late-breaking stage in her life is because a year earlier, Hashem had promised her that she would have a child. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, go and tell Paro this is going to happen, and then the thing happens. In other words, the purpose of miracles being described in the Torah is always to and the Ramban says, go and check, and you'll see every time there's a miracle in the Torah, now you have to check. Every time there's a miracle in the Torah, it's because the Torah is telling us something miraculous, not to tell us, wow, Hashem can do magic tricks, but to show that Hashem actually keeps His word. That's the purpose of the miraculous. So once you understand that the Ramban's whole idea of the miraculous is something like a presentation of the fact that Hashem is keeping what He said He was going to do, then you could start to play a little bit of a dance between the Ramban that says everything is a miracle, it's these hidden miracles, and on the other hand, we don't have miracles all the time being presented to us in the Torah. And what you would simply say, as the beginning of the discussion for the Ramban's approach, is you would say, no, Hashem, you could suggest, the Ramban would say, would be in my camp and say, Hashem is in charge of everything. It's just that we don't always get to see the back story of it, and that leaves us with questions of divine providence versus mishpat and theodicy, and questions of evil in the world. But at the same time, there are miraculous things that happen that speak to what Blau said before, like there are certain events in history that are the fulfillment of prophecies, of things that Hashem promised were going to happen in the world, of things that Hashem, this is going to happen, and then we get to see it as an actual miracle, and that's where we feel Hashem's hand reaching in, we feel the divine providence. And to the degree that a person is on the maslul of those chasidov, of those people who are living in accordance with that which Hashem promised, this divine reward and punishment schema, you get to feel that much more. And that's how I would say to kind of begin to square those Ramban. I don't know if it fully does that, but that's the beginning of the approach to some of the things that Rav Blau shared in terms of his sources. Other questions?
Okay, we'll do one more question. Maybe we'll do a little brief response, but we'll see what we did. So Rav Blau mentioned the idea of free will, like a person's own free will being to the other side of the coin here, right? The more Hashem's involvement in the world, the less it feels that that a person has free will. Maybe I'll just add in sort of like an emotional element, which is that the more you take away Hashem from being active in the world, then you kind of let Hashem off the hook, as it were, for things that aren't so good. On the other hand, the more Hashem is active in the world, the more you have to answer questions like theodicy, like why do these bad things happen on a much more micro level. On the flip side, you have a little bit, seems like a less of a Bechira Chofshi. I wonder how you sort of square those or think about those, but we can keep it brief, that'd be great.
I'm going to give a preview and then we'll expand the question.
That's fine.
Like most things in life, there are experiential advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. So I'm just going to outline what I see as some of the advantages and disadvantages. I think Rav Dovid'l's approach works better for tefillah, meaning I think if you think God's not stepping in all the time, you might not be as excited about making all these bakashot, whereas if you think that God is constantly micromanaging, it gets easier. So I do think my approach is harder for davening. As Rav Adin hinted at, I think my approach is easier for theodicy. Not that it's a total answer, but if Hashem has reasons to let the natural order run its course, it might be easier to explain why bad things happen to good people. Thirdly, I think if you ask me where do you see the implications of this, so here's what I'm most nervous about in terms of the other approach. Okay, I'm sorry to do this. It's a very powerful example. I think if we think about the Haredi world and army service, I think it is clear that my theology would not lead to their position. No, the world really is protected by Chayalim on the Lebanese border and Chayalim going into Gaza, and therefore, if you want to protect the world, that's what you have to do. Or if you take the other position, you might say, no, actually, it's guys in Kola who really produce the schut that protects Am Yisrael, and therefore that's the right position. So any of you who feel strongly that there's really a need to enlist, right? I think that is much more powerful in my perspective than in the other perspective.
First of all, I appreciate the framing of there's kind of these two ends of the spectrum. There's an issue of what we'll either call, on the one end, there's the problem of theodicy and human initiative, I guess, on one side, and the other side is how are you having a relationship with Hashem who is not attending to His world? And those are the two poles of it. I appreciate the question. It very, very clearly outlines the problems with each position. I guess I'll start with the issue of human initiative, which is obviously if you ascribe to the idea that Hashem is running the show, so to speak. So even if you allow for something called Hishtadlut or something like that, and there's a notion of Hishtadlus, and I think it does touch, even though I wasn't really expecting to get into that discussion right now, but I think it does touch on the army issue as well. And that would be that the primary reason that I'm more worried about boxing Hashem out of the discussion and being able to have that relationship with Hashem who is invested in His world I'm going to leave that to the second. I'm going to kind of like buttress why I'm not so worried about the human initiative piece, and that is something called the Torah. We spoke about this before. I think this has come up in previous discussions. That once Hashem reveals His will in the Torah, so it is true that still you're going to have some engagement with Torah sources. And there might be some serious questions that a person can level against somebody who's not enlisting in the army. But if you take Torah seriously and you take halacha seriously, which both Rav Blau and I do, then we can and obviously we're having this panel because we're as educators we're trying to express something to you guys. So I think that if we succeed at getting you to take Torah seriously, then the question of initiative kind of becomes less burning. Because human initiative is something which is mandated by the Torah in so many different ways in so many different places. I mean, the Torah has laws about fighting and protecting the Jewish people, and when you're allowed to do it, and when you're not allowed to do it, and when it is a mitzvah, and when it is an aveira to do that, and when murder is acceptable, and when it is okay, and when it is mandatory. And the same thing is true, in previous years we've had discussions where it's come up, it could limit the amount that a person might see suffering for another person, and they might not act because they think Hashem is just in control. Well, the Torah says that if you see somebody suffering, there's a mitzvah to help them with, even if their donkey is overladen with, there's a prika, there's a mitzvah to take off and to put on and help somebody with their packages, to update it for modern, to bring in their packages or to go visit sick people. And as I said before, I don't really see, I'm not so worried about the idea that Hashem is in control of the final stamp of the story and that God is overseeing everything, there's a divine providence to even the leaves falling, in terms of my initiative in the world, because if I take the Torah seriously, and I take the fact that Hashem is controlling the story, but I think that Hashem also takes the Torah seriously, because He revealed His will in the Torah, and so to the degree that I keep the mitzvos in the Torah, and I see those obligations upon me as real things, so then we could have a debate, or maybe, and I'm not mitigating Rav Blau especially, it is interesting, how could it be that the same people who take the Torah seriously, both the Dati Leumi community and the Haredi community, come to polar opposite conclusions about something as essential as whether or not we should be defending the Jewish people, enlisting and not enlisting, right? And these are serious questions that probably need their own panel, but the question about whether or not I take initiative seriously, I think is mitigated by the fact that we have a Torah, and the Torah is something that tells us where Hashem wants us to exercise our shtadlus, and I would even say that even spills into how seriously we take working for, to provide for our families and doing laundry and things like that. I guess I'll end with one thing just because I can't help myself, but there's a beautiful passage in Rav Kook's Oros HaTshuva, which is relevant to what we're talking about here right now. Rav Kook says that everybody knows, or at least Rav Kook thinks everybody knows, that there's some level of preparation and tshuva that a person does as you're going into Shabbos. When you're going into Shabbos, Shabbos is a time when clearly Hashem is taking more control of the world than we are. And Rav Kook says there's a tshuva that a person needs to do when you're going into Shabbos. Some people go to the mikvah, some people say shir shirim, everybody gets into nice clothing, there's a certain preparation of the home for Shabbos. There's a tshuva, a return to a way of thinking and acting when we're going into Shabbos. What Rav Kook says most people don't realize is that you also have to do tshuva after Shabbos. Why do you have to do tshuva after Shabbos? For keeping Shabbos, says Rav Kook. He doesn't say exactly that, but for keeping Shabbos. Why? Because on Shabbos you became convinced that the 6 days of the week and the work week and the things that I have to do and packing lunches and writing term papers and hustling to make a parnasa and all those things are like, I just want to sit in Shabbos forever. And if tshuva just means recalibration, then you need to re-enter the world and recognize that Shabbos has a place in the world. There's a place for recognizing Hashem, let Hashem take control. And there's also a place for the 6 days of the work week when you have to go and actually do some stuff. And he brings a number of beautiful explanations, because everybody knows that when the Kohen Gadol switches into his special garments that he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, he has to go to the mikvah and wash his hands and feet before. He said, but look, you'll see that he also has to wash his hands and he changes back into his regular clothing. Because the idea that a person would enter into a state of thinking that Hashem is controlling the world has a flip side to it. And the flip side is you need to do tshuva and remind yourself that that doesn't make me not responsible for my part in the world. Meaning there's a responsibility on the human being as well, even if we give God the divine providence. And that, I think that also limits the issues with theodicy as well. Because if theodicy is that we look at evil in the world and we say, well, there's a commandment for us to make the world more bright and more warm. So then the fact that Hashem is running the show doesn't absolve me from my responsibility in the world. And so that's why I'm less nervous about that particular angle.
No, that was great.
Great. Okay, we'll take some questions. Yeah? Great.
I guess this is for either or both of you. Do you feel that it is harmful to attribute too little or too much to God or divine providence? And if so, what are suggestions how to, I guess, maybe find a balance?
So, I'll just say one thing briefly. I think there's a big difference between attributing divine providence in a klali sense, prati klali, meaning Hashem is in control of every single thing in the world, stub my toe, leaves falling, everything like that, but to claim that you understand the calculus of exactly how that works becomes very dangerous. So I would say meaning all sides of this agreement would say you shouldn't be walking around asking yourself why you stubbed your toe, what is the exact thing that caused that to happen. But nor would I say that it's particularly healthy to allow every minor, if you're just a novice servant of God, I wouldn't say that we should spend all day, trying to calculate these things. I think that would be unhealthy, not skipping steps or something like that. But so that's number one. But on the flip side, I would say there's a passage in the Rambam in Mishnah Torah where the Rambam says the flip side of that is in Hilchos Tainios in the laws of the fast days, where the Rambam says that if a calamity happens admittedly to a large group of people, to a tzibor, it's not speaking about a leaf or a person. The Rambam says that it would be callous. It would be achzarius is the language that he uses. It would be callous to say, well, this is just the way of the world. This is just mikra, right? And so a person can begin to, the language that the Gemara uses is that when a person sees like real things that are not going their way, it's probably a good idea, even if you're, no matter what camp you're in, to do a little bit of an accounting and say like, well, what did I do that got me to this place? And part of that might be spiritual, and part of that might be like, I didn't set my alarm, so of course I didn't wake up for davening. And it's not always going to be like, oh, because 3 days ago I did this, so now Hashem is making this happen. That's not necessarily the calculus how a person does it. But a person should generally look into their actions and to figure out, what am I doing that's right and wrong? And it's an invitation to think in that way.
Yeah, very briefly, this is also a response to what Rav Adin said before. Another advantage to Rav Dovid'l's position might be that it leads to a more robust connection to God. I feel like I'm connecting to God all the time. So in terms of what I would say for my position, there's a Rambam in the Parish Mishnayos and Psachim that says, we're grateful for God who created the resources in the world that enabled me to navigate the world. And I think we could say that with all the difficulties in our world, there's tremendous amount of spiritual joys, of physical joys, and we can be grateful that God made a world which enables us to use the resources to harvest them.
I have a question for Rav Dovid'l. So you talk about how everything, like, there's like Hashem is behind it, because Hashem controls the world. And I agree with that with some stance, but I heard you mention just with Sammy's answer, how like if you don't set your alarm for davening. So if I don't wake up naturally for davening in the morning, should I just say, oh Hashem, do you want me to go to Shacharis? Like what do I like?
So I think I addressed that already somewhat. Meaning you have an obligation to wake up for davening.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not going to say that you just simply, and I'll say one step further. If you did set your alarm and it didn't go off, right? So that's also, right? So you set your alarm and it didn't go off. So it doesn't hurt my approach in any way to say that whether the alarm did or did not go off, ultimately because of the first principle that I started, again, it's coming from first principles. Which is why the question is not something I'm actively, the first principle is that if God is recreating the world every second, right, which has many implications in the way that a person views the world, so then not only is he creating the world every second, I would say the difference is, let me use the language of the Maharal, maybe it's helpful. The Maharal in the beginning of, because he also is from this world, the Maharal says in the beginning of Netzach Yisrael, he distinguishes the difference between, the person who built, well, we know for sure, the person who built this structure is no longer alive, right? Rav Adin likes to say it was like a crusader fortress or something, right? So the person who built this fortress is no longer alive. So the fact that they are not influencing and holding up, there's laws of gravity that are holding up the building, and it's kind of running on its own, right? The Maharal says that that's not how we view, or that's not how he views, that's not how he thinks the authentic position of Judaism views how the world is operating. It's not that God sort of created it with these rules that are keeping it in place, but that if for a single second God would stop looking at the world, it would cease to exist. Meaning it's baked into the way. It's not like Hashem created, put all the pieces. The pieces themselves are being created every second by Hashem. Right? So once you start from that first principle, so then it's okay. So Hashem is making the alarm go on or not go on, or even if you did set your alarm and somebody else walked in and they got you. That's all fine, but that has nothing to do with the calculus of you getting up or not getting up, or you have free will to respond to those things as you see fit.
Can I just push a little bit? But I think he's asking about after the fact. Let's say it's now afternoon. Should I look back and say, God did not want me to come to Shacharis this morning?
Wow, so that's already it's a more nuanced question. Just for fun, I'm going to say yes. You should say yes. Just for fun, I'm going to say, right? I'm not sure, just for fun, I'm going to say yes. Yes, you should. From my view, you should. From my view, you should. I'll take a different approach. Right? Let's say somebody came here. I'll make it even more robust. Let's say somebody came here after 18 years of not keeping Shabbos or Kashrus. That could happen, right? And you got turned on, in high school. And you had enough skills to make it into Orayta in this elite program, and you didn't keep Shabbos or Kashrus, and you had never put on tefillin before, right? So there's two approaches. One approach is to say I on some level. Again, this is a much longer conversation, but on some level, God allowed that to happen, that I did not put on tefillin. And that in no way allows me to be lazy in the future. Right? I still have obligations going forward, but that actually, both psychologically and theologically, it would be more helpful and true on some level, looking backwards, to say whatever happened in the past, I attribute that to God's motive. How tshuva plays into this is an important thing. But just for fun, I'm going to say, if you wake up in the morning and you miss Shacharis, it might be helpful to say, well, tomorrow I'm obligated to do that. But it might also be helpful to say, okay, I put that behind me, and now I have to move forward. It's more complicated than that. My fun experiment needs like 2 hours. My fun experiment is based on the approach of the Torah of the Mei Shiloach and Ishbitz, which basically sees the present as the place of action, and all in the past has to be attributed to divine providence. It's more complicated, but...
Got it. Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is for Blau, this specifically. I would say when it comes to most theological approach, not most, but there's a theological approach when it comes to like the creation of the universe. It's an odds game. It's easier to believe that the existence of a God is just statistically more possible than everything coming into chance. So would that also not apply to the even smaller things when you consider like butterfly effect or the odds of a gust of wind happening in a football game on a sunny day? Like, when you get down to the smaller things included, isn't odds still a factor that would imply that Hashem has a more hands-on approach?
Trying to think if I fully understand the question or not. Well, let's try as follows. Let's try the butterfly effect. Okay, what if I say to you that the butterfly flapping its wings in China has impact on one thing going on in North America, but not on 80,000 other things going on in North America? So I don't know if we need a God to explain that. Right? Okay, that's the way it plays out. That the world is a connected place, and some things affect each other. So I'm not 100% sure, maybe I don't get your question fully, but I'm not sure why that would lead necessarily to...
I'm saying like from the statistical analysis that we would say like the universe was created by God, statistically it makes more sense that way. In the same sense, statistically it makes more sense to give credit to God than it would be a butterfly in China. Like, would that not be an argument for
Again,
why?
I still think it's 2 separate questions. What's the best explanation for the world existing? And what's the best explanation for a detail in terms of how that world functions? So I wouldn't assume by definition that the explanation for one is the best explanation for the other. I think you could make an argument. You have to work it out independently. I don't think you can make this easy equation that if that's the best explanation for creation, that's the best explanation for everything else about the world.
All right.
Mitchell.
This is for both of you guys. What do you think there's a possibility that different ideas are attributed to different people? For example, the Gadol Hador is more of Dovid'l system, and regular people are more of Blau system.
Meaning, just a quote.
The way the
Are you saying that Hashem pays more attention to tzaddikim and less to regular people, or are you saying that the approach of certain rabbis, I'm not sure how
way the world works, it could work differently for people depending on who they are. So let's say the Gadol Hador whose whole life is involved with God, the way Hashem runs the world for him, every action, everything happens to him is from Hashem. And the regular person who, sometimes he does davening, then he'll go work a regular job and doesn't, not as fully invested.
Yeah,
is more in the natural.
I got your question. I understand your question. I think that's sort of the way that Blau read the Ramban, right?
Yeah, I think that's, you get that both in Rambam and Ramban. I mean, leaving aside Dovid'l's point about the intellect. But I think, Mitchell, once you do that, maybe I'm cheating here, but I think that you're ready in my camp, because you're saying that God doesn't control everything.
And the way you understand what Blau saying? Meaning, once you would say, Hashem pays more attention here and less here, it is pretty binary, your approach. The approach is either severely limiting Hashem's interaction to major events in history and things like that, and we didn't, I don't want to put words in our mouth, but something like that, to, no, it's everything. Even if it's not in the realm of the human, it's in the realm of the molecular, right? So, but what I would say is, if you double click on what I said from the Ramban, is like, it might be that the Gadol Hador can experience the hand of Hashem more, right? Maybe I'm also cheating, but maybe he would experience the hand of Hashem. Now, you would say he experiences the hand of Hashem and that his life is better than the average person. I would say, well, no. Then you come back to the problem of Tzaddik Viralo, and you come to those issues. But he might experience the hands-on nature of Hashem more than, which maybe is a beautiful place where it dovetails, because like then his intellect is able to appreciate more where Hashem is. I would still say that the Gadol Hador, as you termed it, and the average guy who's, whatever, even the deer in the forest are experiencing the same level of hashkafa. It's just that one of them is experiencing it and the other one is not experiencing it.
Okay, two last questions. Eli and then Louis.
Can I ask a quick? It's a two-part.
Ask you on the side.
One is, I'm assuming like Hasidim that believe go according to Dovid'l, but what do like the majority of like Jewish people overall in like posting posting? I mean, I don't know if there's like a posting like posting on that or how that works exactly, or
It's not exactly the right word, poskim. And there is a discussion about whether like there's psak in Yonei Amuna like this. But I think, as you've heard from both of us, there's enough, we're not 100% sure because there's a lot of source material. And since it's not, we practically both believe you have to get up for Shabbos tomorrow morning. And right? I'm just like, no, you got it this morning. We both believe that you have to set your alarm and get up and there's a level of Shabbos. So like, it's not necessarily the level of psak.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dovid'l, meaning, I'm not so sure this is a case that psak even applies, but let's say for the sake of argument you discovered that it was 55 to 45 in one direction. It doesn't seem to me that you'd be obligated to follow 55. You should figure out what works for you religiously and what makes sense to you. I don't think that every hashkafic issue we just go with the majority.
Okay. And then the second part is for Blau. Like, what would tefillah look according to your, like, how would that be different from the Dovid'ls?
Yeah, I just,
Hold it down.
yeah, can't do that in 30 seconds.
Got it.
Going on a little bit of a stretch here, mainly for a Blau, but also for a Dovid'l. Would someone's belief in divine providence produce a better outcome for growth as a human? I'll give an example. Let's say somebody's an alcoholic, and one night they destroy a bunch of their properties. They destroy $2,000 worth, and that was enough of a realization for them to say, wow, I'm not going to drink anymore because I just damaged part of my property. If he holds that that Hashem interferes in the world, he's saying, oh, Hashem sent me a sign, he wanted me to destroy this property so I don't drink again. If you hold that Hashem doesn't, then you're saying, oh, well, it's just a coincidence, and maybe the belief in Hashem, oh, Hashem sent me a sign, that switch in your head, maybe that could produce a better outcome for growth going forward.
Look, it's a very individualized question, and I don't think there's one answer. Different people react differently to different things. I can see an exact same scenario of somebody saying, well, if it's God did it, I don't worry about it. If it's me, then I should take responsibility. I think it could come both ways.
But just by believing in God, to like say, oh, maybe God sent me a sign, there's a higher likelihood of you wanting to follow that sign as if Hashem sent it to you rather than...
Look, I'll say one thing, there's also a balance here between what you think is the truth and what you think is going to be religiously helpful. And I admit the truth matters, but the truth does not exclusively matter, but it still matters. So if you think one is more reasonable than the other, I think it's hard to make the transfer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I have anything to say to the specific example. I would say that if I believe, which I do, that the truth is that there's divine providence there that doesn't, you would still have to pay for any damages. You would still have to figure out how to make restitution for what you did. But I'm not sure that the truth claim is hurt in any way by the example in either direction.
Yeah, one more.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
How do you relate, I guess I'll ask like this, how do you relate to the idea that the world is made out of letters versus atoms? That's a serious question. I'm going to say especially.
So the truth is, I actually do not relate to it.
Right, that's it.
Meaning, as Dovid'l knows, there are three approaches to why Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh. One of them in the Kabbalistic world is very powerful, that the Hebrew letters were used to create the universe. I would endorse one of the other two positions of why Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh.
Well, I think that question, which it'll come up later in other discussions throughout the year on other panels, is like a first principle that gets to the heart of some of our debate. Whether the world is atoms knocking around, or whether there's letters that are making the basis of communication, and it's a more coded universe. I think that's talk about it.
But they're really last questions. No.
In the Rambam's view, with the klala, if it's just as you become as your like intellect gets higher, is when Hashem affects you more. How then, with the klala, as like you are doing bad, Hashem is affecting you more? Or with the own?
I'm not going to do this in 30 seconds. I'll just tell you to read 317 and 318.
Yes, I will also say read 317 and 318, and you'll see there that the Rambam says that you can be punished as an individual for your individual actions. So read 17 and 18, but then nothing else.
Okay, now you have homework. I want to thank first our Dovid'l and Blau. What you say is the discussion at the end.